For most of American history, cities were built for people. Streets were narrow. Buildings stood close. Life happened within walking distance. Then, something quietly took over the landscape. It didn't rise like a skyscraper. It didn't announce itself like a highway. It spread silently, one empty space at a time. Today, in many American cities, parking takes up more land than housing, offices, parks, and schools combined. This is the story of how parking, something meant to serve cities, ended up reshaping them. Cities don't happen by accident. Every street, every neighborhood, every mile of infrastructure is the result of decisions made long before we ever lived there. In this channel, we don't chase headlines or quick opinions. We slow down. We look at history, design, and the systems beneath the surface. Because to understand cities, you first have to understand the choices that shaped them.
Before the parking lot. How American cities were originally designed. Before parking dominated the American landscape, cities followed a fundamentally different logic. Early American cities were not designed around vehicles because vehicles, as we understand them today, did not exist. Instead, they were shaped by human scale, physical limits, and economic proximity. Boston, Philadelphia, New York, Charleston, these cities emerged in an era where movement was slow, costly, and personal. Walking was the default. Horses were a luxury. Carts were functional, not universal. As a result, urban form followed three simple principles. Density was unavoidable. Distance was expensive. Land was precious. Every building mattered. Every square foot had value. Cities grew inward before they grew outward. 1.2. Streets were not traffic infrastructure. In early American cities, streets were not transportation corridors in the modern sense. They were public rooms. Children played in them. Merchants sold goods from them. Neighbors talked in them. Animals passed through them. Carts moved slowly and yielded to people, not the other way around. The street belonged to everyone. This concept, shared public space, defined urban life for centuries. There were no zoning codes separating uses, no minimum setbacks, no parking requirements. Buildings opened directly onto the street because the street itself was the destination. This created what urban historians now describe as continuous urban fabric, a city without gaps. 1.3. Compact cities were an economic necessity. Compactness was not an aesthetic preference, it was survival. In the 18th and 19th centuries, workers needed to live near jobs. Goods moved at human or animal speed. Infrastructure was expensive to extend. Heating, lighting, and water were limited. Spawns simply did not make sense. A baker lived near the bakery. Dock workers lived near the port. Shopkeepers lived above their stores. This produced mixed-use neighborhoods naturally, without planners, without ideology, without regulation. What modern planners try to recreate, early American cities achieved by default. 1.4. No one planned for empty space. Perhaps the most important difference between early cities and modern ones was this: empty land inside the city was considered a failure. Unused land meant lost economic activity, lower tax revenue, reduced safety, social fragmentation. Every plot needed a purpose. Even courtyards, alleys, and backlots served clear functions: storage, workshops, housing, deliveries. The idea of dedicating large portions of prime urban land to storing private property, idle most of the day, would have been economically absurd. And yet, that is exactly what would happen later. 1.5. The city as a walking machine. Early American cities functioned as what we might call walking machines. Distances were short by necessity. Blocks were narrow. Intersections were frequent. Buildings aligned closely. This created constant street activity, natural surveillance, high social interaction, economic resilience. Cities were loud, crowded, sometimes chaotic, but intensely productive. Importantly, urban land value increased with proximity, not accessibility for vehicles. That logic would later reverse. 1.6. Transportation before the car. Before the automobile, cities adapted to transportation in ways that reinforced density rather than destroying it. Streetcars, ferries, and rail lines extended cities, but they did so in corridors, not blankets. Development clustered around stations. Neighborhoods remained walkable. Even with rail expansion, the city still prioritized people over machines. The idea that transportation should dominate urban design had not yet arrived. 1.7. A subtle warning from history. By the late 19th century, American cities were already facing pressure.
They were dense, they were crowded, they were polluted, they were noisy. But their problems were management problems, not spatial ones. Rather than asking how to make cities less compact, reformers initially asked, how do we improve sanitation? How do we regulate safety? How do we manage growth? The solution was not more space, it was better systems. That distinction matters because when the automobile arrived, American cities made a very different choice. 1.8. The city before parking had no dead zones. One of the most striking characteristics of pre-automobile cities is something modern viewers notice immediately. They had almost no dead space. No vast empty surfaces. No silent asphalt fields. No gaps that killed street life. The city was continuous. That continuous is what made urban life intense and valuable. It is also what parking would later destroy. 1.9. The core question. So here is the question that sets up everything that follows. If American cities functioned, economically, socially, and spatially, without parking for centuries,
why did parking eventually come to dominate them? And more importantly, who benefited from that transformation? And who paid the price? The automobile arrives, a technology that rewrote urban logic. 2.1. The car did not invade the city. It was invited. The automobile did not arrive in American cities as a hostile force. It arrived as a promise. In the early 20th century, the car symbolized freedom, modernity, and personal control over distance. It was faster than walking, more flexible than rail, and unlike the horse, it did not require feeding, stables, or constant maintenance on site. To city leaders, the car appeared to be a technological upgrade, one that could solve existing urban problems rather than create new ones. Congestion caused by carts and streetcars? The car would streamline movement. Public health issues tied to animal waste? The car would clean the streets. Overcrowding in dense neighborhoods? The car would allow people to spread out. From the beginning, the automobile was framed not as a threat to the city, but as its evolution. 2.2. Early cities tried to absorb the car, not serve it. At first, American cities did not redesign themselves around automobiles. They attempted to absorb them. Cars shared streets with pedestrians, bicycles, streetcars, wagons, and vendors. Speed limits were low. Intersections were chaotic. Rules were informal. Importantly, the early automobile was still rare. Most people walked. Some took streetcars. A few owned cars. The city's spatial structure remained intact. What changed was not the layout of the city, but the behavior within it. Streets grew more dangerous. Accidents increased. Conflicts multiplied. But instead of questioning whether cars belonged everywhere, cities asked a different question. How do we make streets safer for cars? That shift would prove decisive. 2.3. The invention of traffic as a concept. Before automobiles, the idea of traffic barely existed. There was movement, but it was slow, social, and negotiated. The car changed that. Speed transformed movement into flow. Flow demanded regulation. Regulation required hierarchy. Gradually, streets were redefined not as public spaces, but as transportation infrastructure. Pedestrians became obstacles. Children became hazards. Street life became interference. Language changed first, then design followed. This conceptual shift laid the groundwork for everything that came next, including parking. Because once streets were no longer places, but corridors, everything that did not move had to be moved off them. 2.4. The first parking problem was not about space. It was about control. Early cars did not have a natural place to go when they stopped. They blocked sidewalks, they cluttered curbs, they interfered with deliveries and streetcars. But this was not initially seen as a land use crisis. It was a management issue. Cities experimented with time limits, parking meters, curb regulations, enforcement zones. The goal was not to provide more space for cars, but to control their impact. At this stage, parking was still considered temporary, marginal, and secondary. No one imagined it would reshape entire cities. 2.5. The critical mistake, treating parking as infrastructure. As car ownership expanded in the 1910s and 1920s, pressure mounted. More cars meant more conflicts, more congestion, more political complaints. Cities faced a choice: limit cars or adapt cities to cars. America chose adaptation. Parking quietly shifted categories. It stopped being seen as a private responsibility and became a public necessity. Once parking was framed as infrastructure, like roads or sewers, the logic changed completely. Infrastructure must be reliable, abundant, predictable,
Scalable. This meant parking could no longer be improvised. It had to be planned. 2.6. Why American cities chose supply over restraint. Unlike some European cities, American cities had two critical advantages that made accommodation easier. Land availability, lower central density. Land was relatively cheap. Downtowns were still growing. Zoning was minimal. Instead of asking how many cars cities should allow, planners asked how many cars cities might need to serve. That distinction matters. Planning for need encourages limits. Planning for demand encourages expansion. Parking supply grew not to solve a problem, but to avoid political conflict. 2.7. The rise of the parking garage. The first large parking garages appeared as technical solutions. They were vertical. They were centralized. They seemed efficient. But they carried an unintended message. Parking belonged in the city core. Once garages existed, they normalized the idea that cars deserved permanent space near destinations. This was not framed as a trade-off. No one publicly asked, what are we giving up to store these vehicles? The cost was hidden in land value, lost activity, and future constraints. 2.8. Streets were widened before buildings were removed. One crucial detail often overlooked is this. Cities did not immediately demolish buildings for parking.
They widened streets, removed trees, flattened sidewalks, simplified intersections. The goal was still movement, not storage. Parking expansion would come later, once street space ran out. By the time that happened, the logic was already locked in. 2.9. The cultural power of the automobile. Beyond engineering and planning, the car carried cultural weight. It symbolized independence, upward mobility, modern citizenship. Restricting cars felt un-American. Providing for them felt progressive. Parking, in this context, was not about convenience. It was about legitimacy. A city that failed to accommodate cars risked appearing outdated, hostile, or economically backward. This fear shaped decisions more than data ever did. 2.10. The turning point. By the late 1920s, the trajectory was clear. Cars were no longer guests in American cities. They were becoming the primary users. But one final shift was needed before parking could truly dominate. Cities needed rules that made parking mandatory, not optional. That shift would come through regulation, and it would change everything.
The law made it mandatory. How parking minimums were born. 3.1. The problem cities thought they were solving. By the early 20th century, American cities were under pressure. Automobile ownership was rising faster than anyone had predicted. Streets were crowded. Curb space was contested. Downtown merchants complained that customers could not park long enough to shop. From the perspective of city officials, the problem appeared straightforward. There were too many cars and not enough places to put them. But this framing was already misleading. Cars were not an external force. They were being actively encouraged. Rather than asking whether unlimited car access was sustainable, cities focused on preventing friction between drivers and businesses. The solution would come not through transportation policy, but through land use law. 3.2. Zoning enters the city. Zoning was not invented for parking. It emerged in the early 1900s as a response to industrialization, public health, and real estate conflicts. Factories next to homes, tall buildings blocking light, dangerous uses near schools. The idea was to separate incompatible activities. By the 1920s, zoning had become a powerful planning tool and a political shield. If something was written into law, responsibility shifted from individual decision-makers to the system itself. That made zoning the perfect mechanism for solving the parking problem without openly debating it. 3.3. The subtle shift from regulating behavior to regulating space. Early traffic laws regulated behavior. Speed limits, right-of-way rules, time limits on curb parking. Zoning regulated space. This distinction is critical. Behavioral rules can adapt. Spatial rules are permanent. When cities began using zoning to require off-street parking, they made a decision that would shape urban form for generations. And it happened quietly. 3.4. The first parking minimums. The earliest parking requirements appeared in the 1930s. They were modest at first. A few spaces per commercial building, some off-street loading areas, rules targeted mainly at downtown congestion. They were justified as technical standards, objective, neutral, professional.
but they were based on assumptions, not evidence. No one knew how much parking was enough. So planners did what seemed reasonable. They overestimated. Because underestimating parking created complaints. Overestimating it created empty space, something no one was yet worried about. 3.5. Why parking minimums spread so quickly? Once parking requirements existed, they spread rapidly across cities and states. There were several reasons. Political safety. Requiring parking avoided angry drivers. Administrative simplicity. Planners could point to a formula instead of negotiating case by case. Business support. Merchants believed parking equaled customers. Professional imitation. Cities copied each other's codes. Within a few decades, parking minimums became standard practice. They were rarely debated, almost never questioned, and nearly impossible to remove once adopted. 3.6. The illusion of neutrality. Parking minimums were presented as neutral technical requirements. They were not. They embedded a powerful assumption into law, that every trip would be made by car. By codifying that assumption, cities made alternative futures harder to imagine. Walking became secondary. Transit became supplemental. Density became suspect. Parking was no longer a response to demand. It became a prerequisite for permission to build. 3.7. How parking minimums changed architecture. Once parking became mandatory, buildings had to adapt. Not to people. Not to streets. But to storage. Architectural priorities shifted. Ground floors were pulled back to make room for lots. Buildings were separated by drive aisles. Entrances moved away from sidewalks. Facades turned inward. The street lost its role as a social interface. It became a service road for accessing parking. Architecture followed the law. 3.9. The death of the continuous city. Parking minimums made one thing unavoidable. Gaps. No matter how carefully designed, parking requires space. And space breaks continuity.
Parking disappeared as a choice. It became background infrastructure, assumed, expected, unquestioned. People stopped asking, "Why is this here?" Instead, they asked, "Why isn't there more?" By making parking mandatory, cities removed it from public debate, and that silence would shape American urbanism for the rest of the century. Asphalt wins: How Parking Destroyed Downtown Density. 4.1. The most profitable building was no building at all. By the mid-20th century, American downtowns faced a new calculation. Land values were rising, buildings were aging, maintenance was expensive, regulations were tightening. Parking offered a paradox. It generated income by removing structures rather than creating them. A surface parking lot required minimal capital, no vertical construction, low maintenance, simple compliance with parking minimums. Compared to renovating or replacing a building, demolition became financially rational, not because parking was productive, but because it was cheap. This logic quietly reshaped downtown real estate decisions across the country. 4.2. The moment demolition became normal. Before parking minimums, demolishing a downtown building created a problem. What would replace it? After parking minimums, demolition solved a problem. Cities needed parking, developers needed compliance, merchants needed convenience. Surface lots were framed as temporary solutions. They rarely were. Once land became a parking lot, the economic pressure to rebuild vanished. The city lost density, not through catastrophe, but through routine approvals. 4.3. Why parking lots never filled the gap they created. When a building disappears, it removes residents, workers, shops, activity, street presence. Parking does not replace any of these. It stores vehicles, not life. Yet zoning codes counted parking as a valid use of land, equivalent to buildings. On paper, Asphalt wins: How Parking Destroyed Downtown Density. 4.1. The most profitable building was no building at all. By the mid-20th century, American downtowns faced a new calculation. Land values were rising, buildings were aging, Maintenance was expensive, regulations were tightening. Parking offered a paradox. It generated income by removing structures rather than creating them. A surface parking lot required minimal capital, no vertical construction, low maintenance, simple compliance with parking minimums. Compared to renovating or replacing a building, demolition became financially rational, not because parking was productive, but because it was cheap. This logic quietly reshaped downtown real estate decisions across the country. 4.2. The moment demolition became normal. Before parking minimums, demolishing a downtown building created a problem. What would replace it? After parking minimums, demolition solved a problem. Cities needed parking, developers needed compliance, merchants needed convenience. Surface lots were framed as temporary solutions. They rarely were. Once land became a parking lot, the economic pressure to rebuild vanished. The city lost density, not through catastrophe, but through routine approvals. 4.3. Why parking lots never filled the gap they created. When a building disappears, it removes residents, workers, shops, activity, street presence. Parking does not replace any of these. It stores vehicles, not life. Yet zoning codes counted parking as a valid use of land, equivalent to buildings. On paper, nothing was lost. In reality, everything was. 4.4. Downtown became a storage facility. As parking expanded, downtowns changed function. They stopped being places to live and work continuously. They became destinations people drove to, used briefly, and left. This altered urban rhythm. Busy during business hours, empty at night, silent on weekends. Density was replaced by throughput. Cities optimized for movement, not presence. 4.5. The economic trap of low-value land use. Surface parking is one of the lowest value uses of urban land. It generates minimal tax revenue, supports few jobs, produces no housing. Yet parking occupied some of the most valuable land in American cities. This created a fiscal paradox. Cities lost revenue while expanding infrastructure costs. More land consumed, more streets maintained, more utilities extended. All to support land uses that barely paid for themselves. 4.6. Why downtowns couldn't recover on their own. Once parking fragmented downtown fabric, rebuilding became structurally difficult. Why? Because every new building now had to provide parking, which meant larger footprints, higher costs, reduced rentable space, lower density. Parking didn't just remove buildings, it prevented their return. 4.7. The disappearing street wall. One of the most visible consequences was the loss of the street wall. Continuous buildings define urban streets. Parking breaks them. As gaps widened, walking became unpleasant, retail suffered, safety declined, investment slowed. The city no longer felt like a place, it felt like an interval between destinations. 4.8. The myth of temporary parking. Cities often justified parking as interim land use, a placeholder until something better arrived. But parking creates its own inertia. Once land is cheap to operate and politically useful, there is little incentive to change it. Temporary became permanent. Across the U.S., temporary parking lots have existed for decades. 4.9. Downtown hollowing was not accidental. This was not decline caused by neglect. It was decline caused by policy. Parking minimums made density difficult. Demolition made parking profitable. Zoning made both legal. Downtown hollowing was the predictable outcome. 4.10. The city after asphalt. By the late 1960s, many American downtowns had crossed a threshold. They were no longer cohesive urban environments. They were collections of buildings floating in seas of parking. The damage was not aesthetic. It was structural. And it would soon push cities toward an even more drastic response: urban renewal. If this perspective is useful, feel free to share it with someone who thinks about cities, housing, or how places actually work. And if you have thoughts on this, especially if you disagree, I'd love to read them in the comments. Urban renewal and the final sacrifice of the city core. 5.1. When cities admitted defeat. By the middle of the 20th century, many American cities reached a quiet conclusion. Downtown was failing. Not failing economically, at least not yet, but failing politically. Merchants complained about access, suburban residents complained about congestion, planners complained about obsolete urban form. Rather than questioning the policies that caused these tensions, cities reframed the problem. The city itself was declared the issue. This reframing made radical intervention not only possible, but inevitable. 5.2. Urban renewal was not about renewal. Urban renewal promised modernization. In practice, it delivered clearance. Federal programs offered funding to demolish what were labeled blighted areas. These areas were rarely empty or unused. They were dense, active, and socially complex. But they did not fit the new spatial logic. They were too compact, too walkable, too resistant to cars. Parking and highways needed space. Urban renewal provided it. 5.3. The Highway Parking Alliance. Highways did not just connect cities, they restructured them. As interstates punched into downtowns, they delivered enormous volumes of cars directly into urban cores. Those cars needed somewhere to go. Parking became the silent partner of highway expansion. Every highway exit required parking. Every parking facility justified more highway capacity. The two systems grew together, reinforcing each other's impact. 5.4. Neighborhoods as obstacles. Urban renewal maps reveal a clear pattern. The neighborhoods most often targeted were dense, low-income, politically weak, racially marginalized. These neighborhoods were not chosen because they were empty. They were chosen because they were vulnerable. Clearing them solved multiple problems at once, at least on paper. Land was freed, parking could be built, traffic could flow. The human cost was categorized as relocation. 5.5. Parking as a tool of displacement. Parking played a specific role in this process. Unlike buildings, parking did not require permanent residence. Unlike highways, it did not generate sustained opposition once built. Parking was flexible, quiet, and politically useful. Entire blocks could be erased and replaced by asphalt, without triggering the backlash that housing demolition alone might have caused. Displacement became diffuse. Damage became normalized. 5.6. The federal seal of approval. Once federal funds backed these projects, parking gained legitimacy. It was no longer a local convenience. It was part of a national modernization effort. Planners framed parking as essential to economic competitiveness. Cities that failed to provide it risked losing investment. Resistance became difficult. Opposition could be dismissed as anti-progress. 5.7. Downtown as an access zone. After renewal, downtowns were no longer centers of life. They became access zones, places you arrived at, used, and left. Parking lots and garages encircled remaining buildings like moats. This changed how people related to the city. Downtown was no longer a place to belong. It was a place to park. 5.8. The illusion of efficiency. Urban renewal promised efficiency, but efficiency was defined narrowly as vehicle throughput. The broader costs were externalized. Lost communities, reduced tax base, increased infrastructure burden, social fragmentation. Parking facilitated all of this by absorbing land without replacing value. 5.9. The point of no return. Once highways, parking structures, and zoning aligned, cities crossed a threshold. Reversing course became expensive, politically risky, technically complex. Urban form had been reset. Parking was no longer a symptom, it was a system. 5.10. What was lost cannot be rebuilt easily. The neighborhoods erased by urban renewal were not frozen in time. They would have evolved. Instead, they were replaced by emptiness. Surface lots do not age. They do not adapt. They do not generate community. What replaced the city core was not a new city. It was absence.
Suburbia, parking, and the new American economy. 6.1. The suburb was not designed to work without parking. Suburbs did not simply grow around the automobile. They were engineered to depend on it. Unlike cities, suburbs lacked density. They lacked proximity. They lacked mixed use. Distance was built into their DNA. Parking was not an accessory. It was a requirement for basic function. Without parking, suburban life collapses. This dependence reshaped not only where Americans lived, but how the economy itself operated. 6.2. Parking as the silent enabler of suburban expansion. Suburban development was marketed as freedom, more space, more privacy, more choice. What was rarely acknowledged was the infrastructure bargain underneath. Low-density living required enormous land consumption for movement and storage. Roads carried cars. Parking stored them. Both were subsidized. Without parking, suburbs could not scale. Without scale, they could not remain affordable. Without affordability, they could not become mainstream. Parking made suburbia possible. 6.3. Retail followed the asphalt. Retail adapted faster than cities. Downtown shops relied on foot traffic. Suburban shops relied on access. Shopping centers were designed not as places, but as parking fields with buildings attached. The most valuable real estate was no longer the storefront. It was the parking ratio. More parking meant more customers. More customers justified more parking. Retail architecture inverted itself. Buildings became secondary. Asphalt became primary. 6.4. The mall as a parking machine. The suburban mall perfected this logic. It was climate-controlled, internally walkable, externally hostile. Every visitor arrived by car. Every trip began and ended in a parking lot. The mall replaced the street, but only after isolating it. Parking did not just serve the mall, it defined it. 6.5. Parking and the consumption economy. As parking spread, consumption patterns changed. People no longer shopped frequently in small amounts. They drove longer distances and bought more at once. Big box retail thrived. Local shops struggled. The economy shifted towards scale, volume, and standardization. Parking enabled this shift by making distance irrelevant. 6.6. The hidden subsidy no one tallied. Parking appears free. It is not. Its costs are distributed across higher rents, higher housing prices, higher infrastructure taxes, environmental damage, lost land productivity. Because parking is bundled into everything, its price is invisible. This invisibility made it politically untouchable. People defend what they believe costs them nothing.
6.7. Why suburban parking could never be reduced easily. Once suburban systems were built around parking, removing it became nearly impossible. Zoning required it. Retail depended on it. Commuting assumed it. Transit struggled to compete because destinations were too spread out. The spatial structure itself enforced car dependency. Parking was not a policy choice anymore. It was embedded. 6.8. The fiscal consequences for cities and towns. Suburban parking created long-term financial strain. Low-density development generates less tax revenue per acre. Parking consumes land without producing value. Infrastructure must be maintained across vast areas. This imbalance forced cities to expand outward to stay solvent. Sprawl was not accidental. It was a financial necessity created by parking-heavy land use. 6.9. The illusion of choice. Suburbia is often framed as consumer preference. In reality, it was a system designed around a single mode of access. You could choose where to live, but you could not choose how to move. Parking locked that choice in place. 6.10. The new American normal. By the late 20th century, parking had achieved something unprecedented. It was no longer questioned, no longer debated, no longer even noticed. It became the background condition of American life. The economy adapted, culture adapted, cities adapted, but the costs continued to accumulate, and eventually they would become impossible to ignore.
The costs we ignored: land, money, and social damage. 7.1. The land we gave away. Land is the foundation of every city's wealth. In productive urban environments, land generates value through housing, jobs, services, culture, tax revenue. Parking generates none of these. It occupies land without activating it. Across American cities, some of the most valuable land is used to store vehicles that sit idle most of the day. This represents one of the largest misallocations of land in modern history. 7.2. The opportunity cost no budget shows. City budgets track expenses. They rarely track opportunity cost. A parking lot may cover its maintenance. It may even generate parking fees. What it does not show is what that land could have produced: housing, retail, offices, public space. Multiply that lost potential across millions of parking spaces, and the scale becomes staggering. Parking did not just consume land, it prevented cities from evolving. 7.3. The financial burden on housing. Parking is built into housing costs. Every required parking space adds construction cost. Every surface lot reduces buildable area. Every garage increases rents. Even households without cars pay for parking. This hidden cost contributes directly to housing affordability problems. In many cities, parking requirements have made modest housing illegal, not because the units were unsafe, but because they lacked enough space to store cars. 7.4. Infrastructure without return. Parking increases infrastructure demand. More roads, more utilities, more maintenance. Yet parking produces minimal tax revenue. Cities face a widening gap between costs and returns. This gap is filled by expansion. More development, more sprawl, more parking. The cycle feeds itself. 7.5. Environmental costs hidden in plain sight. Parking amplifies environmental damage. Paved surfaces increase heat. Stormwater runoff overwhelms systems. Green space disappears. Cars travel farther because destinations are spread out. Emissions rise. Energy use increases. Parking is not neutral infrastructure. It is an environmental multiplier. 7.6. Social distance becomes physical distance. Cities shape relationships. When parking separates buildings, it separates people. Walking declines, casual encounters disappear, public life thins out. Social interaction becomes scheduled and intentional. Spontaneity vanishes. The city becomes a collection of private bubbles connected by driving. 7.7. The loss of independence. Car dependency reduces independence. Children cannot move freely. Older adults become isolated. Non-drivers are marginalized. Parking-heavy environments assume universal access to a car. Those without one are effectively excluded. This exclusion is rarely framed as inequality. It is simply accepted as normal. 7.8. Public space without the public. Parking consumes space that could support civic life. Parks, plazas, libraries, schools. Instead, cities allocate their most accessible land to storage. Public space becomes scarce. Democracy suffers quietly. 7.9. Why these costs were ignored for so long. The costs of parking are delayed, indirect, and distributed.
No single actor feels responsible. No single budget line reveals the damage. Parking appears beneficial in isolation. Its harm emerges only at scale. By the time the pattern became visible, it was deeply embedded. 7.10. The reckoning begins. By the early 21st century, cracks appeared. Housing shortages, fiscal stress, climate pressure, social isolation. Cities began to ask questions they had avoided for decades. What if parking was not a solution? What if it was the problem?
The backlash, when cities started removing parking. 8.1. Questioning parking was once unthinkable. For most of the 20th century, parking was not debated. It was assumed. Proposing fewer parking spaces sounded irrational, almost reckless. Parking symbolized access. Access symbolized prosperity. To question parking was to question growth itself. That is why the first challenges did not come from politicians, but from crisis. 8.2. The pressures that forced the conversation. Three forces converged in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Housing shortages. Cities could not meet demand under existing parking rules. Fiscal stress. Infrastructure costs outpaced revenue. Environmental reality. Sprawl and emissions became politically unavoidable. Parking, once invisible, became implicated in all three. 8.3. The first reforms were technical, not ideological. Early parking reform did not arrive with slogans. It arrived with spreadsheets. Planners noticed something unsettling. Most parking was empty most of the time. Studies showed utilization far below capacity, even in dense areas. This data undermined decades of assumptions. Parking was not scarce. It was overbuilt. 8.4. Pilot projects and quiet experiments. Cities tested change carefully. Reduced minimums near transit. Shared parking agreements. Time-based pricing. These experiments were deliberately modest. The goal was not transformation, but proof. And the proof was immediate. Development increased. Rents stabilized. Traffic did not collapse. What failed was fear. 8.5. The political resistance. Despite evidence, resistance was fierce. Parking touches emotion. It represents convenience, habit, and entitlement. Opponents framed reform as anti-business, anti-worker, anti-family. Public meetings became battlegrounds. But the conflict revealed something important. Most resistance came from expectations, not experience. 8.6. Merchants and the parking myth. Business owners feared losing customers. In reality, many gained foot traffic. As streets improved and density returned, local commerce strengthened. The myth that parking equals prosperity weakened. Accessibility proved more complex than a parking count. 8.7. The role of younger cities and districts. Reform did not start everywhere. It began in places with strong demand, limited land, political flexibility, downtown districts, university areas, historic cores. Success in these zones created templates others could follow. 8.8. Removing minimums was the turning point. The most powerful reform was also the simplest. Eliminate parking minimums. This did not ban parking. It removed compulsion. Developers regained choice. Markets regained signals. Cities regained adaptability. The effect was immediate and lasting. 8.9. What did not happen? Despite dire predictions, cities did not grind to a halt. Neighborhoods did not collapse. Cars did not vanish overnight. What changed was balance. Parking became proportional, not dominant. 8.10. Reform was cultural before it was legal. Ultimately, parking reform succeeded where culture shifted. People experienced better streets, more housing, more life. Once benefits were visible, resistance faded. Parking lost its untouchable status. It became negotiable. What replaced parking? The new shape of American cities. 9.1. The questions cities were afraid to ask. Once cities began removing parking, or at least reducing its dominance, they faced a question that had been postponed for nearly a century. What should this land actually be used for? Parking had functioned as a placeholder for decades. When it disappeared, the city had to decide what it valued. Housing, public space, jobs, density, tax base. This moment revealed priorities more clearly than any planning document ever could. 9.2. Housing returned first. In most American cities, the first replacement for parking was housing. Not because of ideology, but because of math. Parking lots sit on valuable land. Housing generates revenue. Housing addresses visible shortages. Once minimums were reduced or eliminated, developers could finally build on parcels that had been legally frozen for decades. Small lots became viable again. Infill returned. Missing middle housing reappeared. The city began to stitch itself back together. 9.3. Buildings relearned how to touch the street. As parking retreated, architecture changed. Entrances returned to sidewalks. Ground floors reopened to public life. Street walls reformed. Buildings no longer apologized to cars. They addressed people. This shift altered the experience of the city immediately, even before projects were complete. Streets felt safer. Walking felt purposeful. Activity returned. Urban form responded faster than policy ever could. 9.4. Density without chaos. One of the great fears surrounding parking reform was congestion. The reality was more nuanced. As parking decreased, some trips disappeared. Others shifted modes. Many became shorter. Density did not produce chaos. It produced efficiency. Closer destinations reduced travel demand. Mixed use absorbed trips internally. Street life returned without gridlock. The assumption that cars would fill every available space proved false. 9.5. New economies emerged. Replacing parking did not just change form, it changed economics. Land once used for storage began producing. Jobs. Local businesses. Cultural spaces. Tax revenue. Small-scale entrepreneurship thrived in reclaimed spaces. Pop-up retail. Food halls. Live-work units. Community venues. Parking had suppressed these uses by monopolizing land. Its removal revealed latent demand. 9.6. The public space dividend. Some cities chose not to rebuild at all. They returned land to the public. Plazas replaced lots. Parks replaced garages. Streets narrowed. Trees returned. These interventions delivered immediate social returns. People stayed longer. Events multiplied. Identity strengthened. Cities became places again, not just systems. 9.7. Transportation adapted faster than expected. Reducing parking forced change, but it also unlocked options. Transit became more viable. Cycling increased. Walking surged. Importantly, these shifts were not ideological. They were practical. When destinations were closer and environments safer, people adjusted naturally. Parking had suppressed choice. Its removal restored it. 9.9. The myth of universal opposition. Parking reform is often portrayed as politically impossible. In reality, opposition softened once benefits became visible. Residents opposed removal in theory. They supported outcomes in practice. Lower rents? More shops? Safer streets? Higher property values. The fear was louder than the reality. 9.10. The new urban pattern. The cities that replaced parking successfully shared common traits. Flexibility instead of mandates.
Incremental change instead of megaprojects. Human scale instead of vehicular scale. Value creation instead of land consumption. They did not eliminate cars. They rebalanced priorities. The result was not anti-car cities. It was pro-city cities.
The future after parking. What American cities are becoming. 10.1. Parking was never the end goal. Parking was never meant to define cities. It was introduced as a solution to a temporary problem: how to store a new machine. But over time, the solution replaced the question. Cities stopped asking what kind of places they wanted to be. They focused on what kind of vehicles they needed to accommodate. The future after parking begins with reversing that logic. 10.2. The shift from access to presence. For decades, American cities prioritized access. How quickly can you get here? How easily can you leave? What was lost was presence. Being somewhere. Staying somewhere. Living somewhere. As parking recedes, cities are rediscovering presence. Streets become destinations again. Neighborhoods regain continuity. Urban life regains depth. This is not nostalgia. It is structural correction. 10.3. Cities are relearning scarcity. Parking assumed abundance. Abundant land. Abundant energy. Abundant space. The future operates under different constraints. Land is scarce. Housing is scarce. Time is scarce. Public trust is scarce. Cities that continue to treat land as storage will struggle. Cities that treat land as value will adapt. Scarcity forces clarity. 10.4. Flexibility replaces certainty. Parking minimums were about certainty. Predictable numbers. Fixed ratios. Guaranteed outcomes. But certainty froze cities in time. The future favors flexibility. Shared parking instead of dedicated. Pricing instead of mandates. Mixed use instead of separation. Adaptation instead of permanence. Cities are becoming systems again, not diagrams. 10.5. The return of the incremental city. The most successful post-parking cities are not defined by megaprojects. They grow incrementally. Small buildings. Small lots. Small changes. Parking removal makes this possible. When land is freed from storage, it becomes available for experimentation. This is how historic cities grew. And it is how resilient cities will grow again. 10.6. Cars are not disappearing, but they are being repositioned. The future after parking is not anti-car. Cars remain useful. Sometimes essential. What changes is their role. Cars become guests, not hosts. They are accommodated without being prioritized. This balance allows cities to serve more people more efficiently. 10.7. Urban identity reemerges. Parking flattened identity. Every city looked similar from the air. Every downtown dissolved in asphalt. As parking retreats, identity returns. Architecture becomes contextual. Streets become expressive. Public spaces become unique. Cities stop competing on convenience alone. They compete on experience. 10.9. The moral dimension of urban space. Cities are moral instruments.
They express who belongs, who is prioritized, who is excluded. Parking-heavy cities privilege drivers. Post-parking cities privilege participation. This shift is subtle but profound. Urban space becomes shared again. 10.9. What this story was really about. This was never just a story about parking. It was a story about trade-offs we refused to see. We traded density for convenience, community for access, value for storage. Now cities are choosing again. Not perfectly, not uniformly, but deliberately. The future after parking is not guaranteed. It is being negotiated, lot by lot, block by block, city by city. And for the first time in a century, American cities are asking the right question again. What is this space actually for? For over a century, American cities made a quiet trade. We gave land to cars and called it progress. Parking felt neutral, convenient, invisible. But over time, it reshaped where we live, how we move, and who cities are really built for. Today, some cities are pulling back. Not banning cars, but asking harder questions about space, value, and purpose. So here's the question worth debating. If parking shaped American cities this deeply, what should replace it now? More housing? Better streets? Public space? Or something else entirely? I'm interested in how you see it, especially where you live.